Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Suarez. I'm the director of Rare Book School. It's my great honor to welcome you to this, the second annual Rendell Endowed lecture at Rare Book School. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Rendell lecturers and a little bit about our august speaker. For more than 60 years, Ken Rendell has been the proprietor of an eponymous firm specializing in historical letters, documents, and manuscripts. Famous the world over for exposing such forgeries as the Hitler Diaries, Jack the Ripper's Diary, and the Mormon forgeries, Ken has published and been interviewed extensively on these and many other topics related to collection development, World War II, Western Americana forgeries, and manuscripts. Ken Rendell has a long and distinguished history with Rare Book School. He was a founding supporter when the school was at Columbia University. He served on the board of Rare Book School at the University of Virginia from 2000 to 2009, and he has been a steadfast supporter of the school and its many educational initiatives over time. Ken Rendell and his wife Shirley McInerney have generously endowed this annual lecture on the central importance of original manuscripts and rare books to fostering human understanding. Each year, the Kenneth W. Rendell Endowed Lecture at Rare Book School focuses on the connections that rare books and manuscript collecting provide with people, events, and cultures of our past, our shared human history, and the intellectual thrill and emotional pleasures of collecting. This lecture series will, over time, spotlight the roles of collectors, librarians, and dealers, not only in preserving human history, but also in providing insights about our present commitments and our future aspirations. We are most happily indebted to Ken and Shirley for their vision and their largesse. Our speaker tonight, Walter Evans, is a real doctor. Not the PhD kind, but the MD kind, with a distinguished career as a general surgeon, having graduated from the University of Michigan Medical School and completed his general surgery residency at Wayne State University. Following his residency, Dr. Evans began seriously collecting art, acquiring more than 300 major paintings and sculptures and thousands of cartoons and prints. His collection of rare books and manuscripts by and about African Americans is among the largest of its kind in the entire world, amounting to more than 100,000 pieces. Between 1991 and 2007, some 80 works from his collection were part of a traveling exhibition that toured most of the United States, shown in more than 45 museums and university galleries. Dr. Evans has also loaned pieces of his collections to a variety of places, including the home of Detroit's mayor, the offices of university presidents, and through the Art in Embassies program of the United States State Department in our American embassies in South Africa and in Switzerland. At the Savannah College of Art and Design Museum of Art, The Walter O. Evans collection of African American art has pride of place as one of the country's most important collections of African American visual art from the 18th century to the present. The collection has been exhibited at art museums around the country, including the Memorial Art Gallery of the University of Rochester, at the Columbia Museum of Art in South Carolina, the Tacoma Art Museum in Washington, and the Detroit Institute of Arts. Walter Evans's collection of Frederick Douglass manuscripts was the key to David Blythe's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, and now constitutes the Walter Evans collection of Frederick Douglass and Frederick Douglass family papers at Yale University's Beinecke Library. We are thrilled to have Dr. Evans among us as our Rendell lecturer. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for that generous, very generous, more than generous invitation. And thank you for having me come here tonight. 8 o'clock in the morning on March the 8th, 2006, I attended a lecture by Professor Dr. David Blythe from Yale University, historian there. And it was to some middle school teachers. And he was giving this lecture on the Civil War and on Frederick Douglass. So after the lecture, I told him that I had a few Frederick Douglass papers, and I'd like him to see that. And I saw the expression on his face, here it goes again. And so that evening, later that evening, after I went back home, I brought him to my home. This is in my dining room in Savannah, Georgia. And I had made these archival boxes, and this is similar to what he saw on that day. I had been collecting for about 30 years at this time, and I'd had the Frederick Douglass material for about 20 years. When I acquired the Douglass collection, it were in horrible condition, so I first had to get it conserved and then preserved by putting them in these boxes. And one rule that I had is that you could only open one box at a time. So we spent the remainder of the evening opening up these boxes, and I could see him on. Now, if David Blythe was here tonight, this evening, he would tell you, I didn't decide to write that book right away. He decided to write that book that evening. In fact, for the next 13 years, at least twice a year, he would sit in this chair right here. This pointer is, he would sit in this chair for about a week to 10 days, twice a year for 13 days, and at the culmination of that time, he won the Pulitzer Prize based mainly on this collection. And this collection was so different from the other collections of Frederick Douglass because it dealt in large part on the latter third of his life. And Douglass, although he wrote 3 autobiographies, he never talked about his family. He talked about, his wife, Anna Murray, helping him escape, and they got married. And that was the end of it. He never talked about his family. But in this collection, especially in the scrapbooks, he talked about there were so many things in the 9 scrapbooks, and there were newspaper clippings from all over the country that his sons had collected. What you see here are booklets. Douglass would, when he gave lectures from typescripts, and there were these typescripts in this collection, and then many of them he would have published. So these are some of the publications that, including this particular publication up here, on the 5th of July. This women's group in Rochester, where he was living at the time, asked him to speak on the 4th of July. He said, nope, what is this? What to the slave is the 4th of July? And that was the focus of this. But here are some of the other publications he did based on his speeches. Now, how did this all come about? Well, first of all, I got to tell you that David didn't just come himself for those 13 years. He told so many other people, scholars and researchers about this collection, and they came in droves. We always had people coming down. This particular lady here, Celeste Marie Bernier, at the time she first visited me, she was at the University of Nottingham in Nottingham, England. And by the time she published this book, she was head of the English department, head of the Department of African American History at the University of Edinburgh. And she published this book based almost entirely on the collection that we had. But now she has 6 other books coming out on the Douglass family. Here are a couple of the other people who came by several times. This is Lee Fott. She's in Syracuse, Lemoyne University in Syracuse right now. And Rita Roberts. Rita Roberts was actually the only African-American person that came out of the droves that came by. And this is a book that recently came out based on letters. And so most of the letters that she used from our collection were from Douglass's son to his wife. And here we are, David and I, after the Pulitzer Prize. Now, how did all this come about? Well, I'm going to have to go back a few years. After high school, I didn't go straight to college. I went in the U.S. Navy for 3 years. My first year and a half was spent in San Diego, and then I was transferred to Philadelphia. My favorite aunt lived in Philadelphia, and a couple of days after I got to Philadelphia, she gave me a ticket to a church social. As soon as I went to that church social, I think it was on a Friday evening, this young lady and I caught each other's eye, and anyway, she wanted to go to the museum. At 19 years old at the time, I had never been in an art museum in my life, so I took her up on it. But I went to the library on the same street as this museum, Franklin Boulevard, and I went to the librarian and I said, what am I going to see in this museum? This is the museum here. And she said, see the French Impressionists. So I chucked out a whole bunch of French Impressionist books, and Degas, Renoir, and Lautrec, and so on and so forth. And we went to the museum. She didn't realize that I was a fake. But I started telling her about Renoir. I said, do you know that Renoir, even at a kind of an early age, he had severe rheumatitis of his fingers, but he kept on painting. And Degas, you know, he spent time in New Orleans. And I just told her about all these artists that I had never heard of before. Anyway, she was also a reader. She gave me a book on Richard Wright, Native Son. I read that and we discussed it, and then I went through all the books on natives that Richard Wright had written, and she got me involved in reading the British, you know, Dickens and so on, and the French and the Russians. And by the time I got to college a year and a half later, I was pretty well read. So we're going to fast forward. Our relationship broke off. I didn't see much of her after I went to D.C. to college at Howard University. So, but 4 years later, after finishing college and finishing my residency, 8 years later, really, and I started my practice, the Detroit Institute of Arts published The Legend of John Brown. There were 22 in this portfolio. And they commissioned Jacob Lawrence to do this portfolio of 22 silk screens. They owned the originals, and the originals were too fragile to travel. So someone asked me to buy it, and I did. And that was my first, I was not collecting at this time. However, this was in the late 70s. However, about a week or so later, I got a call from a colleague of mine in New York, Dr. Benny Prim, and he was giving this reception and fundraiser for Romare Bearden's wife dance studio. Nanette Bearden had a dance studio, and he asked me if I would come. So I went, and while there, I met Bearden, I met Nanette, and his agent, June Kelly, and his photographer. So after I came back, I asked, in fact, even while I was in New York, I asked his agent and Bearden if I could do the same thing in Detroit. They said, oh, yeah. So later, maybe a couple months later, in the fall of the same year, I had a reception in my house, and I brought over 300 people, and it was a complete success. And I enjoyed, that's me as a much younger age. There's Bearden over there, like if this pointer will work, this Bearden. And there I am at the head of the table. And we had people seated all over the house there for this reception. This was the beginning of inviting luminaries, artists or writers to my home in Detroit, at least twice a year for the entire time that I lived in Detroit until we moved to Savannah in 2001. So, Bearden and I on the streets of Detroit. Elizabeth Catlett came a few months later, and I commissioned her to do a sculpture for me based on black women poets. And this is at her house in Cuernavaca, and she was halfway through this life-size sculpture. Elizabeth Catlett had been to the University of Iowa with Margaret Walker Alexander, and that's how we got the, and here's the finished piece here. And this is another, this is pensive over here, a bronze piece. Now the next few slides I'm gonna rush through because this was during the 80s and the 90s, and I was in New York or Chicago every other weekend, and I was rushing at the time, buying books and manuscripts and artwork. This is the card game by Jacob Lawrence. This Archibald Motley, the Plotters. This is actually now in Cape Town, and it's going to be at the Metropolitan Museum in February. They're doing a show in the Harlem Renaissance. This piece travels quite a bit. Here is Alma Thomas, and that's, this is, I'm sorry. This is Norman Lewis, James Weldon Johnson and some of his works. Margaret Walker Alexander, and this is a reception for her, but look who showed up. I had some jealous people. Not everybody gets to have Rosa Parks in their house. But Margaret Walker came many times, probably more than anyone else. She started calling me to ask me. She lived in Jackson, Mississippi, and she started calling me, can I come to Detroit? I said, of course you can. This is Sterling Brown from DC. He and I became very close friends. Even though I was at Howard 4 years, I did not get a chance to meet him while I was there. He was in the English department. We became very close, and I was taking him to the airport after he was staying with me. Most of these artists and writers came and stayed with me at my home. So sometimes I'd have to take off from work. Sometimes I'd continue working while they were there. But I took him to universities and public schools, even elementary schools. He went to an elementary school while he was there. So these are a couple of his. This is Langston Hughes. I never met him in person. Actually, Gordon Parks took the photo, and this is actually, we acquired at some time later, we acquired this sculpture as well. Now, during the 80s, about the mid-80s, I discovered what we call association copies of books. That is when one luminary inscribes a book to another luminary, and this particular book was inscribed by Langston Hughes to Duke Ellington. Here's another. I want to tell you a little bit about this. This is inscribed by Nancy Cunard to Langston Hughes, and Langston Hughes annotated the whole thing. But when I bought the book, not a single page was attached to the binding. So I had it completely redone. As you can see here, this is a brand new binding, but they took the cloth off the original and put it back on. I was very proud of that. I mean, the book wasn't usable at all as it was. And right now, I think I have hundreds of strong association copies. Here is Claude McKay. This is a painting that Aaron Douglass did in 1941 based on The Negro Speaks a River, which Langston Hughes did, and it was published in the Crisis magazine in 1921. Langston Hughes, who was 18 years old, he was on the train going down from Cleveland, where he graduated from high school, to meet his father that he didn't know very well, who was living in Mexico. Anyway, I was able to get the painting that Aaron Douglass had done. This is Richard Wright in Paris at the Luxembourg Gardens. Whenever I collected books, I tried to get everything that the writer had done. And it wasn't always easy, especially with Zora Neale Hurston here. Paul Laurence Dunbar. He died very, very young, but was quite prolific. Now, there was a lady today asked me, she was so excited that I knew Gwendolyn Brooks. I knew Gwendolyn Brooks very well. I invited her to Detroit at least 3 times. This is my wife at a reception we had for her in our home, and she's in my office, my home office there, signing copies of her books to some of the guests. No, the thing, Gwendolyn Brooks told me a story that when she went to talk, people would ask her, do you know Phyllis Wheatley? Actually, this book is one of the earliest works that I have, not the earliest, this is 1773. Here are a group of Harlem Renaissance artists. This is Anna Bontemps, the lower left, and I'm sorry. There is Rudolph Fisher, the upper left, County Cullen, and upper right, and the lower right is Ralph Ellison. I did not get to meet any of these, but I did know several members of Anna Bontemps' friends. Family, sorry. And here, this is a couple of women from the Harlem Renaissance, Jessie Fawcett and Nella Larson. Nella Larson is becoming so well known. These were extremely talented women during the Harlem Renaissance. In fact, Jessie Fawcett was an editor for the Crisis magazine. I did get a chance to meet Toni Morrison, didn't know her well. And I have several copies of The Blue Is I. She herself did not have an original copy, and I wouldn't give her one of mine. This is an almanac, 1792 almanac by Benjamin Banneker, and I'm sure most of you know the relationship that Benjamin Banneker had to Thomas Jefferson. It was the first almanac that he sent to Thomas Jefferson along with a letter, criticizing his lack of, criticizing the fact that he owned slaves and how he spoke down about the intelligence of African Americans. And he sent them with a copy of the first almanac, which wasn't, it was in the manuscript stage then, I think it was. Jefferson did answer him, by the way. Now, this may be the oldest, or the earliest work that I have of African descent. And this is by Caputin by Jacobus Capitine. His story is very complicated. I won't go into it, but if you're interested, you can look him up. This is from 1742. These are several slave narratives. I wish I had more. I have about 25. I don't know why I didn't get them. You know, Frederick Douglass, there was Jermaine Logan, Henry Box Brown, William Wells Brown, and more. So I have about 25, but I should have had much more. I have no idea why I didn't get more at the time. I have met Baldwin, did not know him well. However, we have quite a few letters. I'm going to talk to you in a minute about those. I have all of his books, of course. At some time during my collecting career, I shall say, advocation, I went out to meet Jacob Lawrence, and this is when he was living at his home. This is up in the studio. I took this photograph myself. I took my twin daughters out to meet him, and we got to be very, very close. You heard about the exhibition that we established, and Jacob Lawrence, this is a painting, an image from his Genesis series. He did an oversized book on the book of Genesis, and there were 8 paintings. I actually have the original paintings from that he did for the Genesis. I commissioned many of these artists. These are 2 commissions from by Richard Hunt. This is at the reception at my home. That's Richard Hunt standing right there. And this is, well, we won't. Anyway, 19th century artists. In the beginning, I did not collect 19th century artists. For the only reason is that they rarely, if ever, painted figures, the African American figures. Usually, they sculpted or painted white Americans, landscapes, or still lifes. And this is Mary Edmonia Lewis. Most of her career was spent in Rome, but she was born in upstate New York. Quite a story she had. Henry Tanner may be called the dean of African American artists. Spent most of his career in Paris. One of the few that had formal training. He was trained at Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts under Thomas Akins for 2 years, 1880 to 1882. But couldn't find work here, so he went to Paris. That painting that I showed you, this painting was actually done. He caught typhoid fever in France and came back to the U.S. To recover. And that painting, his father was having a conclave down. He was a Methodist minister, and they were in Tallahassee, Florida. One of the best-known 19th century artists was Duncanson, Robert S. Duncanson. I want to spend a little bit of time telling you about this gentleman between my wife Linda and myself. This is Oliver Harrington, a cartoonist. Ollie Harrington was run out of the country by Eugene McCarthy in 1951. And I found out that he was living in Berlin. Well, he moved to Berlin after his very close friend Richard Wright died. And he stayed in Berlin until I sent him a letter and asked him if he would come back to the U.S. This is the first time he'd ever come back to the U.S. So actually, this friend of mine, who was a cartoonist also, came back and said, I saw Ollie Harrington. I didn't think he was still alive. And she gave me his address, wrote him. He said, of course. I told him I would take care of all of his experiences, his accommodation, everything. Actually brought him back 3 times. Not only that, while he was in the U.S., before he went to Europe, and really after he was in Paris, he sent cartoons back to the African American press, the New York Amsterdam News, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, etc. And his Bootsy was his main character. Of course, when he got to Berlin, he started most of his cartoons dealt with fascism and anti-fascism. In fact, I was hoping a young lady who's doing a postdoc here at the University of Michigan was going to be here tonight, but she's out of town and she's doing work on the anti-fascism aspect of Ollie Harrington. And here's another one of his cartoons. Now, when he was here on the third trip that I brought him over, Margaret Walker Alexander wanted to meet him. They had a common friend, Richard Wright. And I said, okay, let's do an exhibition of his work. So we did at Jackson State University. And oh, they were so happy. I took this photo, by the way. But the remarkable thing about it is while we were down there, Margaret Walker lives on the street that Medgar Evers was assassinated on. It's now called Margaret Walker Alexander Drive in Jackson. But it was the same street. But while we were down there, Byron de la Beckwith, who assassinated Medgar Evers, was convicted. And it was printed up on the paper while we were down in Jackson. That was so coincidental. These three letters are in the handwriting of John Brown. One of these two I purchased from Rendell Gallery. I can't tell you which one. I have to look in my files, which I didn't do. But these are all in the handwriting of John Brown. These are Malcolm X letters. I have perhaps 100 of Malcolm X letters. The lower one here, he wrote not too long before he was assassinated. This he wrote to Jimmy Booker, who was the editor and publisher of the New York Amsterdam News. And I acquired this. Many times when I acquired letters, I got them from one or two or three different sources. My letters of Malcolm X came from many, many sources. This one here, as I mentioned, came. This letter up here was written when he was in prison in Massachusetts, and he wrote it to someone else who was in prison. And that's why I stamped here, coming from one prison to another. But I have so many letters written to family members, to ministers, to musicians, while he was in prison and beyond. These are letters from Toussaint Louverture. I have about 20 letters that Louverture wrote in the 1790s and early 1800s. This is by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the first emperor of Haiti, after Toussaint was captured by Napoleon's brother-in-law and sent to Paris, and he died. Sent to France, and he died. This is a letter Napoleon wrote to Toussaint, and in 1801. This is going to be at an exhibition at the Pantheon in Paris, opening up on November 8th, along with a few of the other letters. Now, I don't want you people to judge Mr. Bearden here, but I knew that Bearden, please don't judge him or be the jury, but I knew that Bearden, from the first day that I met him, had a mistress. His wife knew it, and a few other people knew it. I knew it because the photographer here and I became very close friends, but I met him, Frank Stewart, at the very same time I met Bearden in New York. And after Bearden passed in '88, and then his wife passed a few months later, I went to see her. And I went to see her to buy some of the art that Bearden had given her. And she told me no, she wasn't going to sell it to me. So I had never met her before that. I didn't meet her. They dated during the entire 1970s, and she broke it off. She married Luther Henderson, who was a very famous musician. Now, Frank took this photograph in the home of Albert Murray, and that's significant because, oh, by the way, it took me 6 years of courting her. Going up, every time I went to New York, I would take her out to plays, I would take her to dinner, I would take her to lunch, I would take her to receptions and parties and everything. It took me 6 years, and she finally sold me a pile of letters this thick that were illustrated. I'll show you a couple of them. In that apartment, Albert Murray's apartment, on the balcony there, overlooking some other buildings in Harlem, is where he got the inspiration to create one of his most famous pieces of art. This is called the Block 2. The Block 1 is at the Metropolitan. But this is one of the letters here on the left that he wrote to Billy, and there are so many, and there are so many illustrated. This is the illustration here in one of the many, many, many letters. And this is one that he wrote to me, that Bearden wrote to me. They were quite different now, as you might imagine. But anyway, we corresponded a lot. I would write letters to these artists and these, sometimes just so I could get answers. And I have so many thousands and thousands of letters from these artists and writers now. Now, this is the Kenneth W. Rendell lecture, is it not? Well, in 1995, Mr. Rendell sent me this book as a gift, and I read it. Now, I'm going to read you, this is from the very first, chapter in the book. I'm going to read it from here. There's also some impalpable quality in a great man's handwriting which draws one to it. People who have never dreamed of collecting, who have never heard of the collection mania will suddenly react to old letters and documents. They're mad to own them. Some human attraction exists in the written word, quite different from the appeal made by printing. This appeal is primarily emotional. Especially this is true of autograph letters. They naturally hold a more personal message in that they interpret the spirit and reflect on the period of the writer who, in informal letters, is off his guard, quite unlike the mood that an author brings to his work when he knows it may be published. It was almost as though Mr. Rendell was in my head and printed exactly what I would have written if I knew how to write like he did. And I'm going to borrow a phrase from the play Hamilton. He was in the room when it happened. I mean, he was in my head, and he wrote exactly. But my reason for collecting goes a little bit further. This is the collection. This announces the collection of Baldwin letters that I collected, and they're now at the Beinecke at Yale. This, I think, announces the Beinecke collection, the Douglass collection of the Douglass papers, which is now online. And the Baldwin letters also online. You can get them. They're digitized. This is from an exhibition that we had at the Quai Branly in Paris. We loaned 125 books, artworks, manuscripts, etc. It was a huge exhibition, by the way, in Paris. This is from the National Library of Scotland of the Douglass papers. This is at the National Gallery of Art. Now, this is the first time the National Library, this is the library of the National Gallery, and this is the first time they had used an outside work, an outsider's material. Not speaking about the gallery now, just the library at the National Gallery. And this was at announcing the Douglass exhibition then. So with me, it's more than just the mania and the thrill and the emotional impact that I get from collecting the letters, but it's in assimilating this material and sharing it with others. I mean, I get such a thrill. I'm not an expert on any of these people, I'm going to tell you, but I just love reading about them and sharing what I have collected with others. And I'll take any questions that you might have. Thank you for listening. Thank you, thank you.
Question. How trusting are you? I mean, you see stuff all over the planet. I mean, you hire guards to go after with it, or, I mean...
It's insured, but you know something? It's not like a patient that I operated on. I mean, if I lose it, I lose it. That's my attitude. But now, some of the artwork at the Delaware Museum of Art in Wilmington, we had a sculpture by Richard Hunt, and there was an arm on it that somebody's coat got stuck in it and it came off. Well, they called Richard Hunt and he welded it back together. And it didn't bother me at all. In Tampa, Florida, a kid went and put crayon all over a Henry O. Tanner painting, the same painting that you saw here. They had it cleaned. And even if a fire had burned it up, I mean, it's not a person. It's a thing. I would have been saddened, but, and things have been lost. Fortunately, they've found everything. I don't think I've really lost, completely everything. But things have been lost that they couldn't find. We had an exhibition in the Netherlands a few years just before the pandemic, and they couldn't find this letter from a Birmingham jail. And I said, oh, it's there. And we were able to prove that, we had photographs by the courier that went over with the material. And eventually they found it. We could prove that it had gone to the museum. And they were able to locate it. But I don't get worried about those type of things because, if I'm operating and a blood vessel gets, interrupted or whatever, and it shoots up to the ceiling in the operating room, I get worried. That's one of the reasons why I'm not practicing. I haven't practiced in 22 years. So anyway, I hope I answered you.
I'm a big Jacob Lawrence fan. You mentioned that you knew him.
Knew him well.
What was he like?
I have a Jacob Lawrence expert in our audience now. He was such a wonderful person. I know you want more than that. But his work really, he put everything into his work. He painted a lot of series and, did narratives of his subject matter and so much of it. And I served on the Catalog Resonate project, and he called me personally. This is after I had known him quite some time, and asked me if I would serve on the staff. I was treasurer for the Catalog Resonate project. It's such an incredible human being. And he asked me if I would be president of his foundation afterwards. So he died in 2000. We started the foundation, I think, in '99, and I served as president until about a month ago, and my wife is now president. But I know I haven't answered your question because he was just such an incredible person, and we can go on, and I love being in his presence. Yes, Barbara?
Take you to the designers of books, so were there Black artists who were designing those book jackets or illustrations that attracted you? And tell me, I'm very curious to learn if you learned about any Black book artists doing the dust jacket work, for example, or book design.
No, I never did. I never did meet I met illustrators, but not, the artists, but not for the design of the covers. Never. Mm-hmm.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. As someone who works in an academic library and receives gifts and archival materials, I'm wondering when you have come to the decision that you want to give or sell a group of items to an academic center, when are you ready to let go of something?
They have to come to me, and they have to want it. I don't, And a lot of times when some of these institutions find that I have gifted works of art or these papers, Douglass, a lot of times then I get, why did you gift it to them or whatever? Well, you never asked me. So, no, they have to come to me and want it. And then there are very few, for instance, SCAD stayed on me. We gifted over 70 major works of art to them, and they stayed on me. And all I said was, these are all artwork now. I said, well, you must create a Center for African American Studies. You must have school children come in for free. And it was one other, similar, condition that I made. And I said, you can have this art. And they did all that I wanted. Oh, you had to have a designated place to show it. But I didn't want them to show it all the time. And they haven't, but they will include, works of art, and they'll have contemporary artists come in. Now, I don't have the wherewithal now to invite a lot of, and this is going to something beyond your question. I don't have the wherewithal now to invite these people to town the way I used to, these writers and artists. But SCAD is doing it now, and I get to meet these young contemporary artists, and it's amazing. So it's evolved. Yes, sir?
Where did you get your Douglass material from?
Oh, now that's a story. That is a story. Basically in two large tranches, but a few dealers, I got pieces from a few other dealers, for instance, antiquarian bookshops and stuff. I can think of one, the Argosy in New York. But the major two tranches came, this is quite a story that I told earlier today to someone. All these antiquarian book dealers knew who I was, and they would call me when they had something before they put it in their catalogs. Well, one day I was in my office, and I saw a catalog, and I saw all this Douglass material listed. And I called him. It was Phil McBlain. He's still in business, by the way. He's in Hampton, Connecticut, right? In New Haven, essentially. And I called him. I said, Phil, I said, you didn't call me to, about this Douglass material. He said, I don't want you to have it. I said, what do you mean? He said, I want it to go to Yale. I said, Yale is not going to pay you 10 cents for that. This is true. I'm telling you, everything that I'm telling you is exactly like it happened. He said, well, I'm going to try to get them to take it. And at that time, these archives and major institutions, they weren't buying it. They wanted people to give it to them, and which they eventually got, as you know. But I said, I'm going to send you